Welcome to Historical Legacies. Here, we dive into history's most intriguing stories, unraveling mysteries, and uncovering truths from the past. Subscribe to join our journey through time's greatest moments. Introduction. From Soldier to Strongman, the Mobutu Sese Seko story. Mobutu Sese Seko, a name synonymous with power, intrigue, and excess, stands as one of Africa's most infamous leaders. Rising from modest beginnings in the Belgian Congo, Mobutu's life is a dramatic tale of ambition, betrayal, and authoritarian rule. Born Joseph-Désiré Mobutu in 1930, he transformed himself into the autocratic ruler of Zaire, modern-day Democratic Republic of Congo, where he ruled for over 3 decades. His era was marked by the complexities of post-colonial Africa, Cold War politics, and a relentless drive for personal power. Mobutu's journey from a soldier to a dictator embodies the turbulent transitions that shaped African nations in the 20th century. Initially, he appeared as a stabilizing force, a military leader eager to modernize and unify a fractured nation. However, his legacy is a tale of sharp contradictions. While he sought to build a national identity through authenticity, his regime epitomized corruption and nepotism. Under Mobutu's rule, Zaire became a Cold War pawn, receiving international support even as his government descended into kleptocracy. This documentary traces Mobutu's dramatic rise, his iron-fisted rule, and his eventual downfall. From his days as a young soldier to his manipulative role in the Congo crisis, and his transformation into a self-styled Leopard king, Mobutu's story offers a compelling window into the promises and pitfalls of post-colonial leadership. It's a narrative of one man's relentless pursuit of power at any cost and the profound impact his rule had on a nation struggling to find its place in the modern world. Part 1. The Early Life of Joseph-Désiré Mobutu. Joseph-Désiré Mobutu was born on October 14, 1930, in the small town of Lisala, located on the banks of the Congo River in the Belgian Congo. His early life was marked by both opportunity and adversity. Mobutu's father, Alberic Mani, served as a cook for a Belgian magistrate, providing a modest income for the family until his untimely death when Mobutu was just 8 years old. Left to care for her children, Mobutu's mother, Marie-Madeleine Yemo, moved frequently, exposing young Mobutu to diverse environments and fostering his adaptability. Raised in the Catholic tradition, Mobutu attended missionary schools where he quickly distinguished himself as intelligent but rebellious. Despite his promise as a student, he often clashed with the strict discipline of the missionaries. One incident saw him expelled for truancy, an act of defiance that hinted at the unorthodox path he would later take in life. Yet, even as a child, Mobutu exhibited charisma and leadership, earning the respect of his peers and demonstrating a talent for navigating authority. Facing limited options under the colonial system, Mobutu joined the Force Publique, the military force established by the Belgian colonial administration. This decision was influenced by his stepfather's advice and the lure of a steady career. The Force Publique was a rigid institution where Congolese soldiers were subjected to Belgian officers, strict discipline, and harsh conditions. Mobutu adapted quickly, showing a knack for understanding power dynamics and forming strategic relationships with his superiors. During his time in the Force Publique, Mobutu developed a voracious appetite for reading, immersing himself in books on history, politics, and military strategy. Inspired by figures like Napoleon Bonaparte, he began to dream of leadership and power, analyzing how great leaders built and sustained their empires. These intellectual pursuits complemented his growing ambition, shaping the foundation of his political aspirations. Mobutu's ability to network and charm those in power set him apart from his peers. He earned the trust of Belgian officers, gaining access to opportunities that many of his contemporaries were denied. By mastering the art of observation and manipulation, Mobutu began positioning himself for a larger role in the Congo's rapidly evolving political landscape. His early years reflect a life of resilience, intelligence, and ambition. Despite the systemic limitations imposed by colonial rule, Mobutu carved out opportunities for himself, building the foundation for his eventual rise. It was during this time that the seeds of his leadership and his penchant for control were sown, setting the stage for his emergence as one of Africa's most influential figures. Part 2. Mobutu's military beginnings. Joseph-Désiré Mobutu's journey to power began long before he seized the reins of Congo's leadership. His early life was shaped by a keen interest in the military, a path that would define his future decisions and leadership style. Born in 1930 in Lisala, a small town in the Belgian Congo, Mobutu was initially not destined for greatness. His family had modest means, and his early years were marked by the challenges of growing up in a colonial state that was struggling under Belgian rule. After completing his primary education, Mobutu's ambitions took him to the capital Leopoldville, now Kinshasa, where he joined the military at the age of 19. The Belgian colonial authorities were looking for African recruits to fill the ranks of the force publique, the colonial army, and Mobutu quickly caught their attention. His discipline and strong character made him a promising candidate for advancement in the military, and he was soon sent to Belgium for further training. Mobutu's time in Belgium was formative, as he was exposed to the complexities of Western military and political thought. He learned much from the Belgian military system, but it was the political atmosphere of the time that would leave the most lasting impression. The rise of nationalist movements across Africa sparked Mobutu's interest in the political landscape, and he began to dream of a future where the Congo could stand on its own feet, free from Belgian control. Returning to Congo in the late 1950s, Mobutu quickly gained a reputation as a competent and loyal officer in the force publique. His military career flourished, and he worked his way up the ranks, eventually earning a position of considerable influence. At the time, the Belgian authorities were wary of the growing nationalist movement in Congo, which led to growing unrest throughout the country. As tensions mounted, Mobutu's role in the military grew more crucial. He was a key figure in the effort to maintain order during the turbulent years leading up to Congo's independence in 1960. His position allowed him to cultivate relationships with prominent political figures, as well as with influential foreign powers, particularly the United States, who saw him as a potential stabilizing force in the region. By the time Congo achieved independence in 1960, Mobutu had already positioned himself as a significant figure in the country's future. He was a rising star within the military, a man of ambition and vision, and he understood that the military would be key to any political shift in Congo. Despite the country's growing independence, Mobutu was acutely aware that the nation's future was uncertain. The military, which had played a central role in maintaining order during the colonial era, was now the most powerful institution in the new nation. Mobutu understood that his future, and the future of the Congo, depended on how he navigated this fragile power structure. His military background, as well as his growing ambition, set the stage for his eventual rise to power. His ability to maneuver through the complex political landscape of the Congo and his deep understanding of the military's power dynamics would soon lead him to take control in a way that would alter the course of Congo's history forever. Part 3. The Congo Crisis, a nation in turmoil. When Congo gained independence from Belgium on June 30th, 1960, it seemed to mark the beginning of a new era for the African nation. The celebrations, however, were quickly overshadowed by deep-rooted political and social instability that would plunge the newly formed nation into crisis. The Congo crisis, as it came to be known, would be marked by intense internal strife, foreign interference, and the desperate scramble for control of the country's vast natural resources. One of the immediate challenges was the division of power between the central government and the various regions, particularly Katanga. Led by Moise Tshombe, Katanga declared independence in a bid to maintain control over its valuable mineral wealth. This secession triggered military confrontations that would lead to widespread violence and instability throughout the country. In the midst of this chaos, Patrice Lumumba, the first Prime Minister of Congo, found himself overwhelmed by the brewing conflict. Lumumba, a charismatic leader and a fervent advocate for Pan-Africanism, had long been a symbol of independence and self-determination for the Congolese people. However, his radical ideas and confrontational approach to foreign powers, particularly Belgium and the United States, earned him powerful enemies. At the same time, the newly formed government in Leopoldville, led by Joseph Kasavubu as president, was fragile and lacked the unity to confront the growing crisis effectively. The military, which had been led by Belgian officers during the colonial era, was not yet under the control of native Congolese leaders, leaving a power vacuum that many hoped would be filled by figures like Mobutu. As the chaos escalated, Mobutu, now a rising officer within the military, saw an opportunity to shape Congo's future. He had been quietly building influence within the armed forces, and his loyalty to the central government was apparent. In the midst of the growing political and military turmoil, Mobutu made a decisive move that would change the trajectory of Congo's history. On September 14, 1960, Mobutu staged a coup against President Kasavubu and Prime Minister Lumumba. He acted swiftly and decisively, seizing control of the country's capital, Leopoldville, with little resistance. Mobutu's coup was strategically timed, occurring in the midst of the international crisis, and was widely supported by the military and some Western powers. The coup marked the beginning of Mobutu's rise to power. He placed President Kasavubu under house arrest and took control of the government, securing his position as the de facto ruler of the nation. Mobutu's decisive intervention was hailed by some as a necessary measure to restore order to a country teetering on the brink of collapse, but it also marked the start of his autocratic rule, which would define the following decades. With the situation in Congo rapidly deteriorating, Mobutu's rise to power was seen by many as a stabilizing force, despite the violent and undemocratic means by which he achieved his position. The collapse of central authority and the emergence of military leadership would set the stage for Mobutu's reign, during which the country would undergo dramatic political and social changes, often at great cost to the Congolese people. As Mobutu consolidated his control, the Congo crisis continued to evolve, drawing in international actors from both the Eastern and Western blocs, each seeking to influence the outcome of the conflict for their own strategic interests. Mobutu's maneuvering during this turbulent time would not only solidify his political position, but would also set the stage for his eventual emergence as one of Africa's longest ruling leaders. Part 4. The Lumumba-Mobutu Connection. Patrice Lumumba's vision for a newly independent Congo was bold, ambitious, and marked by a fierce determination to chart a course free from colonial influence. However, his rise to power would soon set the stage for a complex and eventually tragic relationship with Joseph-Désiré Mobutu, a man who would ultimately overthrow him. Lumumba's radical nationalism and socialist ideals quickly put him at odds with both his domestic rivals and foreign powers, particularly the United States and Belgium. While he sought to unify the country and strengthen its sovereignty, his vision of aligning with the Soviet Union during the Cold War era made him a target for the West, which feared the spread of communism in Africa. In contrast, Mobutu, a military officer with strong ties to the Belgian colonial system, shared few of Lumumba's ideological goals. Mobutu was politically cautious, and he believed the Congo's future depended on maintaining ties with the West. This ideological divergence began to emerge even while the two men initially worked together in the early days of independence. Mobutu's military role during the Congo crisis elevated him to a position of significant influence. Although he initially aligned himself with Lumumba's government, Mobutu's growing concern over Lumumba's socialist policies and the increasing influence of the Soviet Union led him to seek an alternative path. His belief in the Congo's stability through Western support, especially in the context of the Cold War, was at odds with Lumumba's more radical approach to nationalization and foreign relations. As the Congo entered a period of chaos following its independence, the country was plagued by secessionist movements, internal divisions, and political instability. Mobutu's military background allowed him to act as a stabilizing force within the army, but his political ambitions were becoming increasingly evident. When the situation in the country deteriorated, Mobutu saw an opportunity to consolidate his own power. In September 1960, Mobutu executed a coup, with the support of Belgian and U.S. interests, overthrowing Lumumba's government. The coup was swift and effective. Mobutu, backed by the military, took control of the government and had Lumumba arrested. After Lumumba's execution, Mobutu emerged as the de facto leader of the Congo. Mobutu's role in the overthrow of Lumumba is controversial. Some argue he was simply a pawn in the hands of Western powers, while others contend that Mobutu was motivated by a pragmatic desire to prevent the country from descending into total anarchy. What is certain, however, is that the coup allowed Mobutu to rise to power and set the stage for his eventual dominance over the nation. The Lumumba-Mobutu Connection would forever shape the political trajectory of the Congo. Mobutu's subsequent rise to power not only marked the end of Lumumba's life, but also the beginning of a new era of authoritarian rule that would define Mobutu's reign for decades. Part 5. The Seizure of Power, Mobutu's First Coup. The political landscape in the newly independent Congo was fragile and increasingly chaotic. The central government struggled to maintain control over the provinces, and internal divisions, both political and military, were growing more pronounced. It was within this environment of turmoil that Mobutu, a rising military officer, seized his opportunity to take control of the country's future. Mobutu had already positioned himself as a trusted military leader, and his loyalty to the central government had earned him the backing of key figures within the armed forces. But as the political landscape in Congo continued to deteriorate, Mobutu saw an opening to implement his own vision for the country's future. In September 1960, the political crisis reached its boiling point, and Mobutu saw an opportunity to wrest power away from both President Joseph Kasavubu and Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba. The first coup began on September 14, 1960, when Mobutu moved swiftly and decisively, securing key locations within the capital, Leopoldville. In a matter of hours, Mobutu took control of the government's institutions, effectively neutralizing Kasavubu and Lumumba's influence. The coup was executed with precision, and much of the military, along with many Congolese citizens, supported Mobutu's intervention, which they believed was necessary to restore order to a country on the brink of collapse. While Mobutu's actions could be viewed as a response to the ongoing chaos in Congo, they also represented a calculated maneuver to place himself in a position of power. He had become increasingly dissatisfied with the leadership of both Kasavubu and Lumumba, and his coup was the culmination of his ambition and strategic thinking. By the end of the day, Mobutu had effectively ousted the central government and assumed control of the country. Initially, Mobutu's coup was presented as a necessary step to preserve national unity and stabilize Congo's fragile state. He promised to restore order and resolve the political divisions that had plagued the nation since its independence. In the wake of the coup, Mobutu appointed himself as the chief of state and began to consolidate his power within the military and political spheres. However, Mobutu's move to take power was not without its controversies. The coup was criticized by many, both inside and outside Congo, as an undemocratic seizure of power, and it led to the sidelining of many of Congo's political leaders. Despite this, Mobutu quickly gained favor from Western powers, who viewed him as a stabilizing figure during the Cold War. The United States and other Western countries were particularly concerned with the spread of communism in Africa and saw Mobutu as a reliable ally to combat Soviet influence in the region. In the days following the coup, Mobutu consolidated his control by removing Lumumba from office and placing him under house arrest. Lumumba's execution shortly after would have lasting consequences, as it would lead to Mobutu's steady rise to a position of unchecked power and control over the Congolese government. As Mobutu settled into his role as the head of state, he began to shape the political landscape in his image. He began sidelining his rivals, consolidating power within the military, and implementing policies that would further solidify his leadership. Though the country was now under the firm control of Mobutu, it would come at the expense of democratic principles, as his rule would become increasingly authoritarian and repressive. Mobutu's first coup set the stage for his long tenure in power, a period that would last for over 3 decades. It was the beginning of his transformation from a military officer to a political strongman, and his ability to maneuver within the unstable political environment would be central to his rise to power and eventual rule over the country. Part 6. The Rise of Mobutu, Consolidating Authority. After Mobutu's successful coup in 1960, the road to solidifying his control over Congo was far from smooth. The political landscape was fractured, and many factions, both within the military and the government, still had lingering loyalties to previous leaders or rival factions. Mobutu understood that to truly stabilize the country, he needed to transform his position from that of a mere military leader into the undisputed political authority in the nation. In the early years following his coup, Mobutu took decisive steps to build a centralized power structure, carefully aligning himself with the military, key political players, and international supporters. One of his first priorities was eliminating any threats to his leadership. He began by dismantling the power bases of those who had supported Lumumba and his followers. Mobutu's ruthlessness in eliminating rivals, both within the military and government, helped pave the way for his political supremacy. As part of this process, Mobutu reorganized the military to ensure that it was loyal to him personally, rather than to the state or other political figures. By appointing loyalists to key military and governmental positions, he ensured that the apparatus of state power was firmly under his control. He began to exert his influence over the country's legislature, curbing the power of opposition figures and consolidating his rule within both the military and political sectors. Simultaneously, Mobutu worked to strengthen his relationships with foreign powers, particularly the United States and Belgium, who had supported his coup as a means of stabilizing the country amidst the Cold War power struggle. He recognized that foreign aid, both military and economic, would be crucial for maintaining his regime, and he positioned himself as a staunch ally of the West in the fight against communism. In return, Mobutu received military support, economic assistance, and diplomatic recognition, which were vital to his consolidation of power. One of Mobutu's most significant strategies to gain control over Congo's political institutions was his promotion of a new, centralized government structure that allowed him to exert influence over all aspects of national life. In the early 1960s, Mobutu's government restructured the country's provinces, reducing their autonomy and centralizing authority in the capital, Kinshasa. This centralization not only eliminated local sources of power, but also allowed Mobutu to consolidate all decision-making authority in his hands. To maintain the image of a stable and legitimate government, Mobutu began positioning himself as the savior of Congo. He presented himself as the only leader capable of guiding the country through its post-colonial turmoil. This carefully crafted image was crucial in winning the support of many Congolese citizens who were eager for stability and were willing to accept his increasingly authoritarian rule. Mobutu also implemented a policy of authenticity in the early 1970s, renaming the country Zaire and replacing colonial-era symbols with nationalistic ones. This move was part of his broader strategy to strengthen his personal authority and to unite the nation under his vision of a new Congo, free from the influence of its colonial past. He sought to rid the country of all Western influences, advocating for a unique Zairean identity that was rooted in African pride and unity. However, this process of consolidation did not come without its costs. Mobutu's government became increasingly authoritarian, suppressing opposition groups, censoring the media, and undermining any efforts for political pluralism. Political opponents and dissenters were silenced, often through imprisonment or worse, as Mobutu worked to maintain his absolute control over the country. As the years went by, Mobutu's grip on power only strengthened, but so did his reputation for ruthlessness. He was no longer simply a military leader. He was now the embodiment of the state, controlling everything from the economy to the military to the very identity of the nation itself. His regime had entered a new phase, one of dominance and unchecked authority. Part 7. Creating Zaire, the quest for authenticity. By the early 1970s, Mobutu had firmly consolidated his grip on power and sought to solidify his leadership with a national identity that would distinguish Zaire from its colonial past. His new vision for the country involved a dramatic overhaul of its cultural, political, and economic systems, with the goal of creating a sense of Zairean nationalism. Central to this transformation was Mobutu's adoption of the policy of authenticity, which sought to replace the vestiges of colonial influence with symbols and practices that reflected the country's African heritage. In 1971, Mobutu announced that the country's name would be changed from the Republic of the Congo to Zaire, a move that was symbolic of his desire to sever ties with the colonial legacy and create a new national identity. This rebranding was accompanied by the rejection of European-style names in favor of African names, and Mobutu himself changed his name from Joseph-Désiré Mobutu to Mobutu Sese Seko, signaling his commitment to his vision of Zairean sovereignty and authenticity. As part of this process, Mobutu also made significant efforts to dismantle the remnants of colonial rule in the country's institutions, promoting Zairean culture and traditions as the foundation of a new state. The government heavily promoted African languages, including Lingala and Swahili, and discouraged the use of French, which had been the language of the Belgian colonizers. Mobutu even encouraged Zairens to dress in traditional African attire, forbidding the wearing of Western-style suits in favor of brightly colored clothes and the signature leopard skin hat that became Mobutu's personal symbol. Mobutu's quest for authenticity was also reflected in his economic policies, which sought to reduce foreign influence and establish self-sufficiency for Zaire. He implemented a policy of nationalization, taking control of many foreign-owned businesses and industries, including banks, mines, and factories. The government assumed control of the country's vast mineral wealth, particularly its valuable copper and diamond resources, which Mobutu used to further entrench his power. However, while Mobutu's push for authenticity appeared to present a bold vision for a new, independent Zaire, it quickly became clear that his policies were not entirely beneficial for the country. The nationalization efforts led to a significant decline in foreign investment and economic output, as many international companies and governments became wary of doing business in Zaire due to the uncertainty created by Mobutu's policies. While Mobutu reaped the personal rewards of his new centralized control, the nation's economy began to suffer, and infrastructure continued to deteriorate. In parallel, Mobutu's authoritarianism intensified during this period, with the state exercising increasing control over the media, education, and cultural expression. Political opposition was systematically silenced, and dissent was met with brutal force. Any criticism of Mobutu or his government was quickly suppressed, often with violent repercussions for those involved. Mobutu's regime also relied heavily on patronage networks to maintain control, rewarding loyalists with positions of power and access to resources, while opposition figures were either marginalized or eliminated. Mobutu's image as the savior of Zaire, the man who had liberated the country from colonialism and built a new nation, was meticulously cultivated by state propaganda. His authenticity campaign, however, began to take on a more authoritarian tone as he consolidated his power further, demanding not just loyalty, but also personal adoration from the people. As the 1970s drew to a close, Mobutu's vision of Zaire as an African-centered nation was still taking shape, but it was becoming increasingly evident that his pursuit of authenticity was not as successful as he had hoped. The country's economic troubles, coupled with Mobutu's increasing repression, would set the stage for challenges in the years to come. Part 8. The Leopard King, Mobutu's Cult of Personality. By the late 1970s, Mobutu had successfully established himself not only as the leader of Zaire, but as a figure of near-mythical proportions. His quest for power was accompanied by the creation of a cult of personality, which portrayed him as the savior of the nation, a protector of Zaire's sovereignty, an embodiment of the country's ideals. Central to this was Mobutu's carefully constructed public image, which combined elements of African tradition with the grandeur of a modern ruler. Mobutu's personal image became synonymous with Zairean nationalism, as he began to adopt symbols and motifs that linked him to African kings of the past. His most famous icon was the leopard, which Mobutu used to represent his strength, authority, and cunning. The leopard skin hat he wore became a symbol of his power, and the animal itself was seen as a divine protector of the nation. His supporters referred to him as Leopard King, a title that conveyed not just political power, but also spiritual significance. Mobutu's self-image as a larger-than-life figure was amplified through state-controlled media, which portrayed him as a charismatic, all-knowing leader with the ability to guide Zaire to prosperity. Public appearances were carefully orchestrated, with Mobutu often depicted as a man of the people, shaking hands with citizens and smiling down on his adoring supporters. State-sponsored documentaries, films, and articles constantly reminded the population of Mobutu's contributions to Zaire's liberation, his role in Africa's political scene, and his personal sacrifices for the country's well-being. This cult of personality was not just about imagery. It was also deeply tied to Mobutu's political control. He built a strong network of loyalists, individuals who benefited from the regime's patronage system, which rewarded those who openly praised him and his leadership. Political opponents were silenced through intimidation, imprisonment, or worse, ensuring that Mobutu's dominance was uncontested within the country. Any form of dissent was portrayed as a direct threat to the stability of the nation, and Mobutu presented himself as the only person capable of safeguarding Zaire's future. Mobutu's Leopard King persona also extended to his behavior in public life. He maintained a strict image of personal modesty and control, refusing to be photographed without his signature hat, which he considered a sacred symbol of his authority. His speeches often included references to his role as the father of the nation and the protector of Zaire's independence, positioning him as the sole figure who could unify the diverse peoples of the country. As Mobutu's cult of personality flourished, so too did his authoritarian regime. He demanded not just loyalty but also admiration from his people, using both rewards and punishments to enforce this devotion. The state apparatus became deeply entrenched in this personality-driven system, with the media, education system, and cultural institutions all aligning to reinforce Mobutu's image as the Leopard King. This obsession with his own image and the perpetuation of his mythic status created a sense of unity among many Zairans who looked to Mobutu as the embodiment of their national pride. However, it also served to isolate the leader from the realities of governance, as the regime became increasingly disconnected from the needs of the population. Mobutu's personal wealth and lavish lifestyle were in stark contrast to the suffering endured by many of his citizens, but the controlled narrative portrayed him as the benevolent ruler, selflessly working for Zaire's future. The true costs of Mobutu's cult of personality were felt not only in the political repression it engendered, but also in the economic mismanagement and corruption that flourished under his rule. By surrounding himself with sycophants and loyalists, Mobutu's government became a breeding ground for corruption, which further weakened the country's already fragile infrastructure. Part 9. Cold War Politics. Mobutu as the West's ally. As the Cold War raged on in the latter half of the 20th century, global superpowers vied for influence across Africa, and Mobutu Sese Seko's Zaire became a key piece in the geopolitical chess game. Mobutu skillfully navigated the volatile political landscape, positioning himself as an ally to the West in the fight against communism. His close ties to the United States and other Western nations helped him secure both military and financial support, despite his growing reputation for corruption and authoritarian rule. Mobutu's relationship with the West began in the early years of his presidency, when the Cold War context made him a valuable partner for the United States and its allies. In a continent where Soviet-backed revolutionary movements were gaining ground, Mobutu presented himself as a reliable counterweight to communist influence, particularly in Central Africa. The U.S. viewed his regime as an essential bulwark against Soviet expansion, and as such, he was provided with military aid and diplomatic backing. Mobutu's personal charisma and his strategic importance to the West allowed him to portray himself as a savior of Africa, particularly in the context of the Congo crisis and the threat posed by the Soviet-backed Patrice Lumumba. The United States, along with other Western powers, viewed Mobutu as a stabilizing force who could prevent the spread of communism in the heart of Africa. For Mobutu, this relationship was both a pragmatic move and an opportunity to solidify his grip on power, as he used the West's support to maintain his authoritarian rule. In return for military aid and diplomatic recognition, Mobutu was expected to adhere to Western interests, which he did by maintaining a pro-Western stance in the international arena. He supported anti-communist movements across Africa and allowed U.S. military advisors and aid to flow into Zaire. This was a mutually beneficial relationship, as Mobutu could continue to amass power domestically while the West secured a loyal ally in the heart of Africa. However, Mobutu was not content to merely play the role of a puppet leader for the West. He worked hard to cultivate a sense of African unity and independence, portraying himself as a leader who stood up against colonialism and imperialism. He regularly hosted African leaders and international dignitaries, framing Zaire as a central figure in the Pan-Africa movement, even while maintaining a firm alliance with the West. Mobutu's ability to straddle these two worlds, one of international diplomacy and one of local African pride, helped him stay in power throughout much of the Cold War period. Mobutu's close relationship with the US and other Western countries had lasting effects on Zaire, as it allowed him to consolidate his power through foreign aid and military assistance. Western countries continued to support him as long as he remained an effective counterforce to communism, and Mobutu used these resources to further entrench his rule. But this alliance also came at a cost, as the Zairean people were often left to bear the brunt of Mobutu's increasing authoritarianism, corruption, and mismanagement. As the Cold War entered its later stages, Mobutu's image began to shift. The global political environment was changing, and as Soviet influence waned, so did the West's enthusiasm for supporting African dictatorships as part of their broader anti-communist strategy. Mobutu, once seen as a necessary ally, found his relationship with the West becoming increasingly strained as corruption and human rights abuses became more difficult to ignore. Despite this, Mobutu remained resilient, holding on to his power for decades with the support of his Western backers, until the end of the Cold War marked the beginning of his gradual downfall. The changes in international politics would eventually lead to the unraveling of his regime, but in the 1970s and 1980s, Mobutu was still a key player in the global balance of power. Part 10. The Kleptocracy. Corruption under Mobutu. Mobutu Sese Seko's regime is often remembered for the massive corruption that defined his rule, with the accumulation of wealth, resources, and power by Mobutu and his inner circle at the expense of the Zairean people. His reign, marked by the establishment of a brutal kleptocracy, saw the siphoning of millions of dollars from national resources, with Mobutu becoming one of the wealthiest leaders in the world, all while his country sank into poverty and economic ruin. From the very beginning of his rule, Mobutu established a political system that concentrated wealth and resources in the hands of a small elite, which included family members, loyalists, and military officials. The government was deeply corrupt, with officials expected to participate in the plundering of state assets to line their pockets. Mobutu's personal fortune grew exponentially during his time in power, as he and his allies took control of key industries, including mining, oil, and infrastructure. The kleptocratic system Mobutu instituted allowed him to use Zaire's natural resources, particularly its vast mineral wealth, to further his grip on power. The country, rich in cobalt, diamonds, and copper, should have been an economic powerhouse, but under Mobutu's rule, the wealth was extracted and misappropriated, leaving the population impoverished. Mobutu's government took a large cut from the mining operations, and his personal interests were deeply entwined with the extraction of these valuable resources. The state's corruption extended to every level of government, from the president's office to local officials, who were all expected to engage in bribery, embezzlement, and other forms of graft. The public sector was riddled with inefficiency, and many government services that should have been provided to citizens were instead siphoned off by corrupt officials. This system of patronage, where loyalty to Mobutu and personal gain were prioritized over public service, created an environment where public funds were diverted away from essential services such as healthcare, education, and infrastructure development. Mobutu's kleptocracy had a profound impact on the Zairean people, who were forced to endure widespread poverty and a lack of basic services while their leader amassed unimaginable wealth. The people of Zaire witnessed their country's resources being plundered by their own government, while Mobutu and his inner circle lived lavishly. As the country's infrastructure deteriorated and economy faltered, Mobutu's extravagant lifestyle stood in stark contrast to the suffering of his citizens. The international community largely turned a blind eye to the corruption under Mobutu's rule during the Cold War, as he was seen as a key ally in the fight against communism. This tacit approval allowed Mobutu to continue his kleptocratic practices, even as his people's living standards plummeted. While the West remained complicit in supporting his regime, they were also aware of Mobutu's corruption, but his loyalty to their geopolitical interests kept them from taking significant action against him. Over time, Mobutu's ability to maintain his lavish lifestyle and the country's systemic corruption contributed to the erosion of trust in his leadership. The once wealthy state of Zaire became a shadow of its former self, with widespread poverty, dilapidated infrastructure, and a crumbling economy. Mobutu's kleptocracy not only poisoned the political landscape, but also severely hindered the country's ability to develop in a sustainable and productive way. By the time the international community finally turned against Mobutu in the 1990s, it was too late to undo the damage caused by his greed and mismanagement. Zaire was in ruins, and Mobutu's image as a leader who could have been a unifying figure for the country had long since faded, replaced by that of a dictator who had bled his nation dry for his own personal gain. Mobutu's kleptocracy was one of the key factors that led to his downfall, as it became impossible to ignore the widespread corruption that underpinned his rule. Part 11. Repression and Resistance. Silencing Opposition. Throughout his reign, Mobutu Sese Seko maintained tight control over Zaire through a combination of repression, fear, and strategic manipulation of opposition forces. The regime was notorious for its violent suppression of dissent, with Mobutu deploying a vast network of secret police and military forces to silence critics and maintain his grip on power. Anyone who dared challenge his authority, whether politically, socially, or even intellectually, faced severe consequences. Mobutu's regime stifled any form of political opposition, creating a climate of fear and intimidation where speaking out against the government was a dangerous act. The press was heavily censored, and journalists faced imprisonment, torture, or even death for publishing anything critical of Mobutu or his administration. Political opponents, too, were often subjected to imprisonment, forced exile, or worse. The opposition to Mobutu's rule did not completely disappear, however, and many individuals and movements resisted his authoritarian regime despite the risks. In the 1980s, Zaire saw the emergence of a growing opposition movement, consisting of activists, intellectuals, and former government officials who began to speak out against Mobutu's corrupt practices and authoritarian rule. Despite Mobutu's attempt to isolate and crush these movements, their resistance remained an ever-present challenge to his power. A significant source of opposition came from various student groups, trade unions, and civil society organizations that called for reforms, better living conditions, and an end to the rampant corruption. These groups, often operating underground, gained traction by exposing the failures of Mobutu's policies and shedding light on the suffering of the population. Their demands for a more transparent government and democratic reforms were met with harsh reprisals, but their persistence continued to fuel the growing sense of discontent among the people. Despite the repression, Mobutu's regime could not entirely extinguish the flames of resistance, and in the late 1980s and early 1990s, political opposition began to organize more effectively. The launch of the Pan-African movement in the early 1990s and the establishment of multi-party politics provided a platform for more vocal resistance against the regime. However, Mobutu remained resilient and employed brutal tactics to suppress opposition leaders, often using his military forces to imprison, exile, or eliminate those who posed a threat to his rule. Yet, as Mobutu's grip on power began to loosen, so did the intensity of resistance. The ongoing economic decline, the widespread corruption, and the inability of the regime to provide for the people created an atmosphere of disillusionment and frustration that gave rise to more outspoken opposition leaders. In 1990, Mobutu promised reforms, including the legalization of opposition political parties, but the moves were seen as too little, too late, and failed to quell the rising tide of dissatisfaction. One of the key players in the resistance against Mobutu was Laurent Désiré Kabila, a former ally who would later become the leader of the rebellion that ultimately brought down Mobutu's regime. Kabila's opposition group, the Alliance of Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Congo Zaire, AFDL, was instrumental in galvanizing the population against Mobutu's corrupt and oppressive rule. As Mobutu's power continued to deteriorate, the AFDL gained significant support, and the people of Zaire began to demand an end to the dictatorship. Mobutu's failure to address the growing calls for reform and his brutal repression of opposition movements played a pivotal role in his eventual downfall. The resistance forces that had been building for years found fertile ground in a nation weary of Mobutu's rule and eager for change. In the final years of his regime, Mobutu became increasingly isolated, with former allies turning against him and international pressure mounting for reform. Despite his best efforts to suppress dissent, Mobutu was no longer able to maintain control of the situation. Part 12. Zaire's Economic Collapse. The Cost of Mismanagement. Mobutu Sese Seko's regime, despite its initial promises of modernization and prosperity, eventually led Zaire into an economic crisis of catastrophic proportions. The country, once rich in natural resources like copper, cobalt, and diamonds, became infamous for its crippling poverty and mismanagement. Mobutu's leadership, characterized by corruption and neglect, steered the country towards economic collapse, and by the 1980s, Zaire was sinking deeper into an abyss of financial ruin. Mobutu's government was largely built on a network of patronage and cronyism, with much of the nation's wealth concentrated in the hands of a small elite. This network of loyalists, including family members and close associates, controlled much of the national resources, diverting funds away from essential public services like education, healthcare, and infrastructure. The country's wealth, rather than being reinvested into development, was siphoned off into foreign bank accounts and lavish spending by Mobutu and his inner circle. The government's grip on the economy became even more tenuous as corruption spread to all levels of society, from the government ministries to local businesses. State-owned enterprises, once considered the backbone of Zaire's economy, were mismanaged or sold off to cronies for a fraction of their true value. Industrial output plummeted, and agricultural production, which had once been a vital source of income for the country, stagnated as the country's infrastructure deteriorated. Despite Mobutu's outward image of stability, the nation's economic indicators were grim. By the mid-1980s, Zaire was plagued by hyperinflation, with prices spiraling out of control. The currency, the Zaire, lost much of its value, and unemployment rates soared as businesses closed and industries struggled to survive under the weight of mismanagement and corruption. The country's debt continued to rise as Mobutu sought international loans to maintain his regime's lavish lifestyle, but much of this money was embezzled rather than invested in the country's infrastructure. As the economy continued to spiral downward, Mobutu's government relied increasingly on foreign aid to sustain itself. The West, particularly the United States and France, had long supported Mobutu as a strategic ally in the fight against communism during the Cold War, but by the 1980s, this support began to dwindle. The economic crisis, combined with Mobutu's continued human rights abuses and corruption, eroded his once solid relationships with foreign governments. In response to the growing economic turmoil, Mobutu made some attempts at reforms, such as privatization and economic liberalization, but these efforts were often sabotaged by corruption and a lack of political will. The global economy had also shifted, and the rise of new economic powers in Africa, such as Nigeria and South Africa, meant that Zaire's strategic importance was fading. International aid dwindled as donor countries began to question Mobutu's ability to govern effectively. By the 1990s, the country was in a state of near collapse. Public services were practically non-existent, and the majority of Zaire's population lived in extreme poverty. The country's infrastructure, once a source of pride, had fallen apart, with roads, schools, and hospitals left in disrepair. The social fabric of Zaire had begun to unravel, as citizens were forced to fend for themselves in a country without the basic necessities for survival. The failure of the Zairean economy was inextricably linked to Mobutu's kleptocratic regime, where the nation's wealth was plundered for personal gain rather than invested in the future of the country. As the governance power waned and the opposition grew more vocal, the collapse of Zaire's economy became a central issue that further fueled the popular discontent. The economic misery experienced by the people of Zaire was a major contributing factor to the eventual overthrow of Mobutu and the end of his reign. Part 13. The End of the Cold War. Mobutu's Waning Power. As the 1980s came to a close, the geopolitical landscape shifted dramatically, heralding the decline of Cold War tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. For Mobutu Sese Seko, this change marked the beginning of his regime's unraveling, as the strategic value he had once held in the eyes of the West diminished. During the Cold War, Mobutu had been a key ally of the United States, positioning himself as a bulwark against the spread of communism in Central Africa. In return, he received political and military support, including billions in foreign aid, which allowed him to maintain his iron grip on Zaire. However, The end of the Cold War, marked by the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, meant that Mobutu's usefulness to the West was now in question. The geopolitical dynamics were shifting, and Western governments, particularly the United States and its European allies, began to reassess their relationships with Mobutu. The end of the ideological battle between capitalism and communism removed much of the rationale for supporting authoritarian regimes like Mobutu's, especially as the international community increasingly valued democracy and human rights. The financial and political support Mobutu had relied on began to dry up, as the West turned its attention to other, emerging concerns in the region. The global landscape had changed, and with it, Mobutu's ability to maintain the foreign backing he had once enjoyed. Furthermore, Mobutu's refusal to embrace democratic reforms, despite mounting pressure both from within his country and from international organizations, eroded his credibility and legitimacy as a leader. Internally, Zaire's population had grown increasingly disillusioned with Mobutu's rule. The economic collapse and widespread poverty had led to growing frustration, and political opposition movements were gaining momentum. While Mobutu had used repression to quell opposition in the past, by the early 1990s, the opposition had become more organized, and public demonstrations against his regime were becoming more frequent. The public's frustration was compounded by a rising sense of hopelessness, as Zaire's economic decline continued unabated, and Mobutu's kleptocracy remained entrenched. Mobutu's increasing isolation on the international stage mirrored his weakening control at home. The fall of the Berlin Wall and the subsequent wave of democratization movements across Africa also contributed to Mobutu's waning influence. Many African countries were beginning to embrace reform, and leaders like Nelson Mandela were emerging as symbols of change and hope, in stark contrast to Mobutu's corrupt and dictatorial rule. Mobutu, however, remained resolutely opposed to any political or economic reform, further alienating himself from both his own people and the international community. The final blow to Mobutu's rule came with the rise of the Rwandan genocide in 1994. The violence and instability that followed destabilized the Great Lakes region and created an environment in which Mobutu's regime could no longer maintain its grip on power. The influx of refugees into Zaire, including many from Rwanda, exacerbated the country's already dire economic and social conditions. Meanwhile, rebel movements, particularly the Alliance of Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Congo, AFDL, began to gain traction in eastern Zaire. Mobutu, weakened and isolated, struggled to maintain control of his country as the AFDL, led by Laurent Desire Kabila, advanced toward the capital, Kinshasa. The international community, including former allies, had largely turned their back on Mobutu, and his efforts to rally support were unsuccessful. His inability to adapt to the changing political and economic climate left him with few options, and by 1997, Mobutu was forced into exile. Mobutu Sese Seko's 32-year reign came to a dramatic and ignominious end as Laurent Kabila's forces captured Kinshasa and Mobutu fled to Morocco, where he died shortly afterward. His fall from power marked the end of an era of authoritarian rule in Central Africa, but it also highlighted the dangers of corruption, mismanagement, and the inability to adapt to changing political realities. The legacy of Mobutu's rule remains a tragic reminder of the consequences of dictatorship and the failure to meet the needs of a country and its people. Part 14. The Fall of Mobutu, the Rise of Laurent Kabila. By the mid-1990s, Mobutu Sese Seko's once formidable grip on power in Zaire had eroded dramatically. The economic and political turmoil that had plagued the country for years, combined with his increasingly autocratic rule, led to a growing dissatisfaction among the population. The decade of the 1990s saw a significant shift in the political climate across Africa, with the collapse of several dictatorial regimes, including Mobutu's, which was soon to follow. Mobutu's regime, built on the pillars of corruption and patronage, had already caused widespread hardship, but the final blow would come from multiple internal and external factors. In 1994, neighboring Rwanda was plunged into a horrific genocide, which saw over 1 million people killed in ethnic violence. The ensuing refugee crisis forced hundreds of thousands of people, including armed militias, to flee into eastern Zaire. These refugees, many of whom were involved in the genocidal violence, brought chaos and insecurity to Zaire's eastern provinces, further weakening Mobutu's control. Simultaneously, the regional powers of Rwanda and Uganda, both with vested interests in the instability of Zaire, began to provide support to rebel groups that sought to overthrow Mobutu. At the center of these rebel movements was Laurent Kabila, a former ally of Mobutu who had become disillusioned with the regime over the years. Kabila, who had been in exile for much of Mobutu's rule, was a key figure in rallying opposition forces against the dictator. He was able to unite a number of armed groups, including many exiled Zairans and forces from Rwanda and Uganda, under the banner of the Alliance of Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Congo-Zaire, AFDL. Kabila's coalition not only promised to remove Mobutu from power, but also to reform the country and end years of mismanagement and corruption. The AFDL's military campaign quickly gained traction as Mobutu's army, demoralized and poorly equipped, struggled to mount a successful defense. The rebels advanced through eastern Zaire, taking city after city, with Kinshasa, the capital, becoming the ultimate prize. Mobutu's government was further weakened by his deteriorating health. He was reportedly suffering from prostate cancer, making him unable to effectively command his forces. As support from the international community waned, Mobutu's regime was left isolated and increasingly fragile. By the spring of 1997, Kabila's forces reached Kinshasa, the heart of Mobutu's power. The city fell with relatively little resistance, as the remaining members of Mobutu's government deserted him and fled the capital. Mobutu, fearing the loss of his wealth and status, took flight, first to Morocco and then to France, marking the formal end of his 32-year reign. His departure from Zaire was symbolic of the collapse of an entire political order, which had been built on personal loyalty, patronage, and the suppression of opposition. In the wake of Mobutu's departure, Kabila took control of Kinshasa, declaring himself the new leader of the Democratic Republic of Congo. While Mobutu's fall brought an end to his corrupt and dictatorial rule, it did not usher in the promised era of peace and stability for Zaire. Kabila's leadership would face its own set of challenges, including internal power struggles and growing dissatisfaction with his failure to deliver on his promises of reform. Although the Mobutu regime had crumbled, the legacy of its corruption, mismanagement, and instability continued to haunt the country, and Zaire's problems were far from over. The rise of Laurent Kabila, supported by regional powers such as Rwanda and Uganda, signaled the end of an era for Zaire, but it also marked the beginning of yet another period of conflict and uncertainty for the Democratic Republic of the Congo. In retrospect, Mobutu's fall was not only the end of his personal rule, but also a critical turning point in the history of the region, as it reshaped both the internal dynamics of the DRC and its relationships with neighboring countries. Kabila's rise to power demonstrated the fragility of Mobutu's political system and how easily it could unravel when faced with external pressure and internal resistance. The fall of Mobutu Sese Seko serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of authoritarianism, mismanagement, and corruption. His departure did not bring the stability many had hoped for, but instead, it set the stage for further instability and bloodshed in the years that followed. The DRC would continue to struggle with its legacy for decades to come, as the country fought to rebuild and redefine itself after the fall of one of Africa's most enduring dictatorships. Part 15. Mobutu's Legacy. Lessons from a Strongman's Reign. Mobutu Sese Seko's reign left an enduring and controversial legacy in the history of the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Africa as a whole. Though Mobutu is remembered by some as a leader who aimed to modernize his country, the consequences of his rule were far-reaching and deeply damaging. His governance, characterized by personal ambition, unchecked power, and rampant corruption, left Zaire economically crippled and politically unstable. Mobutu's early years in power were marked by attempts at national cohesion and modernization, but his increasingly dictatorial policies and disregard for governance led to widespread public discontent. A significant aspect of Mobutu's legacy is the concept of authenticity, the nationalistic campaign he launched to rid the country of colonial influences. In 1971, he renamed the country from the Republic of the Congo to Zaire, symbolizing a desire to reclaim African identity and unity. However, this campaign, which included forcing people to adopt African names and rejecting Western influences, failed to produce any meaningful progress for the people. While Mobutu's actions initially generated some support, it soon became clear that the nation was only being reshaped to serve his personal interests and ego. Mobutu's regime was founded on the principles of kleptocracy and patronage, which undermined the nation's institutions. His personal wealth grew astronomically while the country's economy faltered under the weight of corruption. He amassed billions of dollars in state funds, diverting foreign aid for his personal use and that of his family and close allies. The Zairean people suffered as basic services deteriorated, and resources that should have been used for development were siphoned off into Mobutu's pockets. The political climate under Mobutu was marked by repression and a lack of political freedom. Opposition was not tolerated, and Mobutu's government relied on brutal tactics to silence dissent. The press was censored, and political opponents were either exiled, imprisoned, or eliminated, further straining the legitimacy of his rule. Despite his tight control, Mobutu never fully secured the loyalty of his military or his political elite, many of whom became disillusioned with the regime as corruption spread throughout the country. Despite his authoritarianism, Mobutu remained a key figure during the Cold War. The United States and other Western powers viewed him as a strategic ally in the fight against communism, providing him with military and economic aid in exchange for his alignment with Western interests. However, as the Cold War ended and the international order shifted, Mobutu's alliances weakened, and his oppressive rule became harder to justify on the global stage. The fall of Mobutu's regime highlighted the dangers of unchecked authoritarianism and the fragility of political systems built on personal power rather than democratic institutions. The collapse of his rule, marked by the rise of Laurent Kabila, underscores the unpredictability of life under strongman leadership, where power is often maintained at the expense of the people. Mobutu's legacy serves as a stark reminder of the perils of corruption, poor governance, and the failure to create a sustainable democratic system. His story is one of opportunity lost, with Zaire, now the DRC, still grappling with the consequences of his reign and the continued challenge of rebuilding a country torn by decades of misrule. Thanks for tuning in to Historical Legacies. If you enjoyed this dive into history, please like, subscribe, and share. Join us next time for more fascinating stories from the past.